Welcome to the mysterious casebook where every story hides a secret. Tonight we follow the keen mind of Sherlock Holmes into a wedding shrouded in terror. A bride vanishes before the vows, leaving only a trail of white petals and silence. Where are you joining us from tonight? Now pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. The morning mist clung low over Marylebone as I descended the steps of 221B Baker Street, eager to begin what I imagined would be an ordinary Sunday. The church bells were tolling across the city, their peals softened by the fog that curled like pipe smoke through the lamplight. I had scarcely rounded the corner to fetch the latest edition of the Times when I found Holmes already perched in his usual chair, a telegram unopened in one hand and a violin balanced precariously on his knee. He didn't greet me. Instead, he muttered, "A wedding, Watson, and a disappearance. The two seldom go hand in hand unless tragedy binds them." "What's this?" I asked, taking the telegram from him. He waved his hand. "Read aloud." "It's from Inspector Gregson." I unfolded the crisp yellow paper. The bride disappears moments before exchanging vows. Church locked. No sign of struggle. Groom in shock. Mother hysterical. Society watches. Assist urgently. St. Hilda's, Camden Road. I lowered the paper. A bride vanished in the aisle? Holmes leaned back, in full view of 200 guests. Vanished, Watson, in the truest sense. One moment present. The next, nothing but a bouquet lying at the altar. An invitation to the impossible. By 11:30 we arrived at St. Hilda's Church, an austere Romanesque building hemmed in by iron gates and tall plane trees. A crowd lingered outside, murmuring in huddles, their attention flitting from the church door to a nervous constable posted by the entrance. Gregson greeted us with a short nod, his usually ruddy face tinged with confusion. "She was right there, Holmes," Gregson said, gesturing toward the nave, walking down the aisle with her father. A dozen steps from the altar, then poof. Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Poof is not a word I often find in police reports, Inspector." "I'm at a loss," Gregson grunted. "The witnesses say she simply stopped walking, smiled, and the next moment she was gone. No screams, no noise, nothing but the veil, the bouquet, and a chapel full of silence. We followed him inside. The church was eerily quiet. Light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patches across the worn stone floor. The altar remained adorned for a wedding, though the guests had been cleared out save a few close relatives seated in pews under constabulary watch. The groom sat alone in the second row, his head bowed, hands clasped like a man in desperate prayer. Holmes studied him from afar before his eyes swept toward the altar. He strolled forward, stopping precisely at the spot Gregson indicated. "There," said the inspector, "that's where she disappeared." Holmes knelt, examining the floor with a jeweler's loupe he'd produced from his pocket. After a minute, he grunted softly. "No scuff marks," he muttered. "Not a footprint out of place. Not even a dragged hem. Watson, take note. She left no sign of departure." The vanishing bride. The bride, as we soon learned, was Miss Honora Calvel, the only daughter of industrialist Robert Calvel, known throughout London for his rail investments and frequent appearances in the society pages. She had been engaged to Mr. Percival Finch, a barrister of good standing, recently appointed to the Inner Temple. "I watched her walk toward me," Finch told us, his voice barely audible. Her eyes were fixed on mine. There was a flicker in her expression of confusion, almost, and then she was gone. I thought I'd lost my mind. Holmes observed the young man closely. "And you saw nothing else? No movement from the guests? No shadows or sounds?" Finch shook his head. "Nothing, I swear it. And what of her veil?" "She removed it just before stepping onto the chancel. It fell to the floor. The bouquet was already in her hand. Both are still here. But she disappeared. Holmes walked over to examine the discarded veil and bouquet, his fingers gliding over them without lifting. Lavender and waxflower. Curious choices for a winter bride. I furrowed my brow. Holmes, surely you don't think the floral arrangement is the least important detail? Quite so, but that makes it worth examining, does it not? He turned suddenly and addressed Gregson, who locked the church. The verger. He locked the doors after the wedding party arrived, as per the family's wishes. Only the front doors were open during the ceremony, and no one left by any side entrance? Impossible, said the verger, who had joined us from the sacristy. I was stationed by the vestry. No one passed me. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. So she vanished in a sealed church filled with witnesses without disturbing her dress or the floor, leaving behind her veil and flowers. Curious indeed. Surely threads. We began interviewing those closest to Honora. Her mother, pale and tear-streaked, clutched a silk handkerchief and spoke with a vacant calm that unnerved me. She had no reason to flee, she insisted. She was happier than I've ever seen her. We made no enemies. She adored Percival. Any recent changes in behavior? Holmes asked. She grew quiet these past few weeks, distracted. But I thought it was nerves. The father, Robert Calville, was a contrasting, booming, angry, red-faced. If someone's harmed her, I'll have their head, he snapped. This is an abduction, a kidnapping. That groom had better not be hiding anything. Holmes narrowed his gaze. Why assume foul play, sir? 'Cause my daughter is no coward, and no magician could have made her disappear. Holmes gave a soft smile. Oh, I wouldn't underestimate the powers of misdirection, Mr. Calville. As we stepped back into the nave, Holmes paused to look once more at the altar. He took a long breath, then turned to me. Watson, tell me, what do you suppose it means when a bride walks halfway to the altar and never completes the aisle? That something, or someone, stopped her. Indeed. But not, I think, in the way everyone believes. He glanced toward the vestry door, then toward the rose-coloured glass window above the pulpit. There's something false about this space, something that doesn't quite belong. I was about to ask what he meant when he held up a finger. Let us leave, Watson. The answer is not in what was seen, but in what was not. We must visit Miss Calvelle's dressing room next. And with that, we turned our backs on the silent altar and the veil that lay like a question no one yet knew how to answer. The sacristy of St. Hilda's was a modest room panelled in dark oak, its stone floor half covered by a Persian rug that had seen better decades. The air was heavy with incense and dust, an aroma oddly reverent and yet tinged with something stale. It was here that Miss Honora Calvelle had prepared herself for the ceremony, slipping into her ivory gown beneath the watchful eyes of her mother and two bridesmaids. According to the verger, it had been locked ever since the disappearance. Holmes stood at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, as though weighing the atmosphere before entering. He finally stepped inside, eyes flitting across the room with the calculated serenity of a man cataloguing every discrepancy. Note, Watson, he said softly, how still the room feels, not just empty, but preserved as though no one dares disturb it. The dressing table against the far wall was still strewn with remnants of preparation, a silver hairbrush, a flask of rosewater, a powder box with a cracked lid, and a handwritten list of ceremonial steps laid neatly beside a half-eaten biscuit. Holmes bent to examine the floor. 3 sets of footprints, muddy, from the churchyard. 2 with shallow treads, the bridesmaids, no doubt, and 1 deeper, slightly turned outward. Miss Calville? I suggested, most likely. Note the spacing between steps, a nervous gait, hesitant. He frowned. Yet it ends here. He pointed to a faint scuff near the base of the dressing screen. She stood behind this screen to dress. No sign she emerged again through this door. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "are you implying she may never have walked down the aisle at all?" He tilted his head, eyes glinting with amusement. "We are entertaining all possibilities, Watson. That is the duty of true inquiry. Whether she walked down the aisle or a clever impersonator did, we must ask the most outlandish questions, if only to eliminate them." I looked at the dressing screen, a tall structure of ivory silk embroidered with a garland of lilies. Holmes stepped behind it, crouching slightly. A moment later he emerged, holding something between his fingers. A thread. Crimson silk. Not from the wedding dress, I think. He tucked it into his pocket and gestured toward the mirror above the dressing table. The glass had been wiped hastily, but a faint outline of writing, perhaps a fingertip sketch, remained in the misted surface. Holmes struck a match and held it beneath the mirror, coaxing the outline into view. "Letters," he murmured. "An S, possibly? Or a 5? Incomplete. It's been partially erased." Before I could inquire further, a knock came at the sacristy door. A constable stepped in, removing his helmet with a respectful nod. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've located the vicar, Reverend Stroud. He's returned from his visit to Kent and says he may have information." "Excellent," said Holmes, brushing his coat. "Watson, let us see what wisdom the cloth might lend us." The vicar's reflection. We found Reverend Stroud seated in a vestry chair, hands folded over a battered copy of the Book of Common Prayer. He was a gentle-faced man of about 60, with round spectacles and a voice soft as vellum pages. "I returned by the noon train," he said, "only to find the church in chaos. I'm told Honora vanished during the ceremony." Holmes nodded. "Quite so. Did you officiate the rehearsal?" "Yes, 3 days prior, everything went smoothly." Honora was somewhat distracted, I thought. She asked peculiar questions. Holmes's brow lifted. "Such as?" She asked whether the church had ever had secret passages, or if anyone had ever disappeared from the nave before. I told her no, of course, but she looked well pleased, as though she'd confirmed something. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "That's most illuminating, Reverend. Do you know of any structural oddities within the church?" Stroud sighed. "There are whispers of a priest's passage built during the Reformation. Smugglers once used the space behind the altar wall, but it's long since been bricked up." "Whispers," Holmes mused. "And in churches, whispers often linger longer than mortar." The bridesmaids speak back in the side chapel. The 2 bridesmaids awaited questioning. One was Honora's cousin, a prim girl with gold spectacles and an air of relentless propriety. The other, a Miss Delia Marchant, seemed less composed, eyes darting nervously, fingers fidgeting with her corsage. "She was pale this morning," Delia said. "Quiet, yes, but that was normal for her. She wasn't one for frivolity." "And did she say anything unusual before leaving the sacristy?" Holmes asked. Delia hesitated. "She asked if I'd keep an eye on her father during the ceremony." Holmes cocked his head. "Why?" "She didn't say anything, just that he might try something." "That he might try something," Holmes repeated slowly. "Not say or do something, but try." "An ambiguous word, Miss Marchant. Did it trouble you?" "Not at the time. I was nervous." "And was her father present at the rehearsal?" "No, he was abroad until yesterday morning, I believe." Holmes's fingers drummed against his lapel. "Fascinating. Miss Calvell watches her father, asks after hidden passages, and then disappears into air thicker than cathedral incense." He turned to me as the 2 women were dismissed. "Watson, what is the probability that this young woman disappeared due to coercion?" High, I'd say, I replied, especially if she feared her father. Holmes shook his head. I disagree. It is lower than it appears. A coerced victim leaves subtle resistance, shifted objects, footprints in retreat, a torn veil, a cry. None of these are present. You think she vanished by design? I think she orchestrated her vanishing. His expression turned suddenly grave, but the question remains why stage one's own disappearance on the very morning of one's wedding, in the presence of 200 witnesses, and leave behind no explanation. He turned abruptly toward the church door. We must visit the Calvel estate. Something in her room may explain what she could not say aloud. And so we left St. Hilda's behind us, its altar empty and its secrets buried in incense and stone, chasing the ghost of a bride who had walked only halfway into matrimony and vanished into legend. The Calvel estate stood upon the northern edge of Regent's Park, its red brick facade stern against the greying afternoon. A wrought iron fence encircled the property like a guarded secret, and ivy clung possessively to the high walls as if it too wished to keep the family's affairs hidden. Inside, the drawing rooms bore the heaviness of old money oil portraits, mahogany sideboards, and Persian carpets thick enough to muffle footfalls and suspicions alike. Holmes and I were shown in by a door-faced butler who eyed Holmes's scuffed shoes and my rain-spotted overcoat with the faintest flicker of disapproval. Yet he said nothing, merely led us up a wide staircase to the east wing, where the bride's chambers overlooked the garden. Robert Calvel awaited us at the door. He had changed from his morning finery into a dark velvet smoking coat and appeared no less agitated for it. His brows were knit, and he held a glass of brandy that sloshed gently in his grip. I still don't see the purpose of rummaging through her things, he growled. She isn't a child who's run off with a scullery boy. No, Holmes said mildly, but you believe she's been taken. And when someone is taken, the motive often begins in the smallest of places, a letter, a trinket, a ticket stub. You'd be surprised how much a drawer can confess. Without waiting for permission, he stepped past the man and into the room. I followed, noting the slight tremor in Calvel's hand as he drained the brandy. The bride's sanctuary. Honora's room was neat, yet lived in. The wallpaper, a pale rose pattern, framed an iron bed adorned with lace-trimmed pillows. On the vanity sat a miniature portrait of her mother, flanked by a string of pearls and a hand mirror of French glass. A shawl, hastily folded, lay across the chaise lounge. There was no chaos here, no sign of panic or rushed departure. Holmes drifted to the writing desk. The blotter was clean, the inkwell capped. A single envelope lay tucked under the edge of a closed ledger. "Watson," he murmured, passing it to me. It was addressed simply, to be opened in case of delay. Inside was a note, written in a slanted, careful hand. If I do not return, know this, I was never running from love, only from lies. Do not look to the altar, but to the garden. There is more than one way to bury the truth. Holmes's eyes gleamed. She expected the possibility of not returning. Yet she specifies no fear, only deception. And the garden he turned on his heel and strode to the window, pushing the lace curtain aside. Below us stretched the Calvel garden, a manicured expanse of trimmed hedges, gravel paths, and a modest conservatory tucked in the far corner. Holmes tapped the glass. When was it last used? Calvel, who had followed us into the room, barked a humourless laugh. You'd have to ask the gardener. No one stepped in it for months. Full of broken pots and spiders. Ah, said Holmes, then it is precisely the sort of place secrets like to hide. The secret, beneath the glass, With Calvel muttering behind us, we descended into the garden. A light drizzle had begun to fall, darkening the gravel and lending the hedges a slick gleam. The conservatory stood like a forgotten relic, its frame green with age and its windows fogged by time and damp. Holmes paused before the door, then produced a small twist of wire from his pocket and inserted it into the latch. "I believe it's still technically your property, Mr. Calvel," he said without looking back, "but I find legal niceties often move slower than the criminal mind." With a soft click, the door creaked open. The interior smelled of earth and mildew. Rusted tools lay scattered across a bench, and a broken watering can rested in the corner like a slumped sentry. Holmes scanned the room quickly, then dropped to one knee near a stack of clay pots. He moved them aside one by one until his hand paused mid-reach. "There," he said. Beneath the stack, partially concealed by a tattered tarpaulin, was a shallow cavity in the floor, a space just wide enough to hold a tin strongbox. Holmes lifted it gently and set it atop the work table. The lock had been forced previously, and the lid opened with a tired groan. Inside were several folded pages, brittle with age. He lifted one out carefully and read aloud. "Private Ledger, 1882-1887 Calvel Shipping Consortium. Internal transfers." "Red route. What is that?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer at once. He continued to scan the documents, his expression sharpening with each line. "These are records," he finally said, "of a secondary shipping route, one not declared in the consortium's official filings, transactions to names and locations well beyond British waters, payments, hush fees, and one familiar name." He turned the page and tapped a line. "R. Finch, payment received for vessel concealment, Calcutta Docks, 1884. "Finch," I breathed. "The groom, his father," Holmes corrected. "Percival Finch, Sr. But that connection puts the young barrister's rise into a new light, does it not?" "And Honora must have found these records," I added, "hidden away here in the garden." Holmes nodded and knew what they meant. It appears our vanished bride was not merely fleeing a ceremony, but attempting to expose a long-buried scandal. Her disappearance may not have been an escape, it may have been an interception. An ominous turn. Back in the drawing room, Holmes paced before the hearth, the documents spread across a side table. Calvel remained standing by the window, his jaw tight. "These documents could ruin me," he muttered. Holmes didn't look up. "And yet your daughter still left them behind." "Curious? What are you implying?" Holmes folded his arms. "Only that she meant them to be found, meaning she planned to return or intended someone to follow the trail. Either way, it's clear she believed someone was watching, someone close." "Are you accusing me?" Calvel snapped. "No," Holmes said softly. "I'm stating that the answer may not lie in who had most to gain, but in who had most to lose." He turned to me and tapped the envelope we had found. "We must revisit St. Hilda's, Watson. The answer, I believe, begins with that faint writing on the mirror. This ledger may reveal the why, but the how is still hidden in that church." As we stepped out once more into the rain, Holmes paused beneath the portico and lit a cigarette with practiced calm. "She disappeared not to escape her fate, Watson, but to force our hand. The question is, who else knew of her plan?" The rain had abated by the time we arrived once more at St. Hilda's. A thin veil of mist clung to the roof tiles, and the afternoon sunlight now filtered weakly through the stained glass, casting fractured colours onto the flagstone floor. Inside, the church had been emptied of its mourners and murmuring onlookers. All that remained was the echo of footsteps and the lingering scent of white lilies at the altar. Holmes moved with quiet determination toward the sacristy, his coat still damp at the shoulders. He paused just before entering, his eyes scanning the height and breadth of the walls, noting the narrow windows, the recesses behind the organ pipes, and the stout crucifix above the vestry door. "The architecture here is not merely for grandeur," he murmured. "It's a design layered with concealment, built in an era when secrecy could mean survival." Once inside the sacristy, Holmes returned to the bride's mirror. The faint lettering he had glimpsed earlier had grown even fainter, but with the help of a strip of paper dusted lightly with lampblack, he coaxed out a partial message. "St. Ed Dove 9th Bell." He held the strip aloft, squinting. It's incomplete, like a whisper that trailed off, but Saint, likely the beginning of a place name or a saint. Ed Dove could be a distorted rendering or a code. Could it be St. Edward's Dove? I offered. Holmes nodded slowly. Possibly. Or St. Edmund's Dovecote, or even Study Door. This is the difficulty with semi-erased texts. Still, the most actionable phrase is the final one. "Ninth bell." "The ninth bell of what?" I asked. "Hours? Chimes?" "Most likely the latter. Church bells mark the hour with chimes. The ninth bell would correspond to 9 o'clock. He tapped the paper again. Whatever was meant to occur, or already occurred, may be tied to a time or a signal. We exited the sacristy and made our way back through the nave. Holmes paused midway, staring upward at the high wooden ceiling. The acoustics in this space are significant. One could be standing in the gallery and hear the faintest movement at the door. He turned on his heel. "Let us check the bell tower, Watson." The bell tower and the hidden space. The ascent to the bell tower was narrow and steep, the stone steps worn with age. We passed by dusty hymnals, a rusted baptismal font, and eventually emerged into the upper gallery where the pull ropes dangled like limp marionette strings. A young constable, stationed there by Gregson, rose to greet us. "No one's touched a thing, Mr. Holmes." "Good," said Holmes. "You may want to remain by the stairs. If I call, do not hesitate to descend with haste." The constable saluted and stepped aside. Holmes approached the ropes, each one labelled with a brass tag, denoting the note it sounded. He ran his fingers lightly along the 9th rope from the left. "This is the E-bell," he said. "Fitting, perhaps, for a bride who vanished with the echo of wedding vows still in the air." He gave the rope a cautious tug, not enough to ring it, but enough to feel the tension. Then he traced the path of the rope upward into the wooden housing above. "Watson, help me move this hatch." Together we shifted aside a hinged wooden panel in the far corner, revealing a narrow crawl space between the beams. A draught of cooler air wafted out, and with it the unmistakable scent of lavender soap and rose powder. Holmes leaned in. "There's been someone up here, recently." He produced his lantern and lit it. The beam cut through the dim interior, revealing a small recess nestled behind the bell housing. Inside was a shawl ivory with a pale embroidered border. Next to it, a single glove and an empty glass vial. Holmes held up the vial and sniffed it. "Ether," he said grimly. My pulse quickened. She was drugged. Possibly. Or perhaps she carried it herself. Ether can be used to sedate or to faint convincingly. But how would she get up here unnoticed? Holmes pointed to a small trapdoor behind the organ housing. This church was once a monastery. There are passages built for movement between levels, likely for monastic processions. I'd wager she made her way up during the confusion of the entrance, possibly during the opening hymn. It would take no more than 30 seconds to slip through the vestry, use the passage, and vanish from view. And then what? Remain hidden here? Holmes shrugged. "Until the 9th bell, perhaps." He retrieved a folded scrap of paper lodged beneath the shawl. "If you are reading this, I was right to leave. The truth lies not in the altar, but in the echo of its bells. I fear not for my safety, but for yours. Trust no man who smiles at scandal. A Holmes read it aloud, then stared into the shadows for a long moment. She planned it all, I whispered. She staged her disappearance to draw attention to the documents and perhaps to someone who would have stopped her from revealing them. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and yet she miscalculated something. She never intended to vanish completely. There was a rendezvous likely set for 9 o'clock. But with whom? The man with a silver chain. As we descended the tower, Holmes suddenly paused midway. "Watson," he said slowly, "did you notice the man in the third pew this morning? The one with the monocle and the silver watch chain?" Holmes nodded. He was not on the guest list, according to Gregson, nor did he appear in the registry. Yet he arrived early, departed late, and said nothing. You think he was the rendezvous? Or the jailer? Perhaps both. Back on the main floor, Holmes conferred briefly with the constable before we returned to Baker Street. As the hansom cab rattled across the cobbles, I sat in stunned silence, the pieces slowly knitting together. Holmes, meanwhile, looked out the window with that gleam in his eye I knew all too well. "We are drawing close, Watson," he said softly. But close to what? A rescue or a reckoning remains to be seen. By the time we reached Baker Street, the fog had returned thick and heavy, rolling off the Thames like smoke from an unseen fire. It wrapped the city in silence, muffling the clatter of hooves and the cries of paperboys, until London became a whisper of itself. Inside our sitting room, Holmes immediately cast off his coat and stood before the fire, arms crossed, his mind visibly whirring behind sharp, calculating eyes. I busied myself lighting the lamps and fetching my notebook, but he interrupted me with a sudden, sharp gesture. "Watson, the man with the silver watch chain, let us consider him in full." I paused. He was sitting in the third pew from the front, left-hand side. Alone, middle-aged, military-bearing perhaps. "You noted the monocle?" "Yes, a curious affectation used more often to deflect than to examine. But it was the chain that interested me." Holmes began pacing now, his words quickening. "Engraved, just barely, with the crest of the Penfold Club." I blinked. "The Penfold Club? That's a private gentleman's society, is it not? Political influence, old money, foreign liaisons? Precisely. And their motto, probitas silentium. Silence is integrity." Holmes turned sharply. "Tell me, what sort of man attends a society wedding without an invitation, arrives before the guests and slips away unnoticed after the bride vanishes?" "One who wasn't there for the bride." Holmes smiled faintly. "Correct. I believe our mystery man was there not to witness matrimony, but to prevent disclosure. A visit to the Penfold Club that very evening. Holmes secured an appointment through means he did not divulge to visit the Penfold Club under the pretense of discussing certain artifacts from Tibet with its secretary. The club, nestled discreetly in a Georgian townhouse off Pall Mall, exuded the polished chill of old blood and older secrets. We were admitted through an antechamber lined with colonial maps and mounted tiger heads, then shown to a private lounge, thick with cigar smoke and hushed conversation. Holmes wore his most unassuming expression as we were greeted by a portly man in dove-grey gloves. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the man said. "And Dr. Watson, of course. We've heard of your exploits." "Then I shall not bore you with fresh introductions," Holmes replied evenly. "We come regarding a gentleman seen at St. Hilda's yesterday morning, a man of your membership." The porter's brow furrowed slightly. "You understand that we do not disclose member movements?" "Of course," Holmes said, producing a photograph from the inside of his coat, a blurry image captured by a new device recently demonstrated at the Royal Society. "Perhaps you would simply tell me if this man is known to you." The porter hesitated. That is Colonel Archibald Penkett, retired. An occasional guest of the club, though not technically a member. Holmes's eyes glittered. A colonel, you say? Interesting. Does he reside in London? The man coughed into his gloved hand. He keeps rooms at the Langham, though I believe he is expected to return to Brussels shortly. Holmes offered a gracious smile. Thank you. You've been most illuminating. As we turned to go, I whispered, You're convinced he's involved? I am convinced he knows more than he wishes to, Holmes murmured. And I would like to know what ties a retired colonel to a missing bride and a set of falsified shipping ledgers. The Langham encounter. We arrived at the Langham Hotel just after 8. Holmes made no attempt at subtlety here. He approached the concierge with his usual directness. Colonel Penkett, room 203, I believe. Tell him he has visitors. The concierge, evidently recognizing Holmes, nodded and dispatched a bellboy. Minutes later, we were led to a lavishly appointed suite on the 2nd floor. Penkett himself answered the door. He was tall, clean-shaven, and wore a double-breasted housecoat embroidered with the initials AP, Mr. Holmes, he said, with a guarded smile. I wondered when you might arrive. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Then you know why I'm here, I can guess. Penkett stepped aside, gesturing us into the room. Though I suggest we speak plainly. I detest veiled accusations. The sitting room was adorned with travel curios and hunting trophies, Zanzibar masks, an old dueling pistol, and a lion's paw mounted on brass. Holmes stood before the fireplace. You were present at the wedding of Miss Honora Calvel. You sat in the 3rd pew and left as the commotion began. Penkett remained motionless. So? You had no known association with either family, and yet you arrived early. Watched quietly, departed alone. Penkett sighed and moved to pour a brandy. Miss Calvel is my goddaughter. That caught me off guard. But she's never mentioned. She wouldn't, he interrupted. Her father forbade it. Robert Calvel and I parted ways some 20 years ago under strained circumstances. He didn't care for the company I kept, nor I his. Holmes studied him. Did she reach out to you? She wrote to me a fortnight ago. Said she'd uncovered something that frightened her. She didn't specify what, only that she believed she was being watched. She asked me to come to the wedding, not as a guest, but as a silent observer. And did you observe anything? Only that she seemed prepared, unusually calm, even as she approached the altar. Then gone. Penkett crossed to a cabinet and opened a small drawer. He retrieved a silver cigarette case and handed it to Holmes. She sent me this the morning of the wedding. It arrived by courier. Look inside. Holmes opened it. Inside, embedded within the velvet lining, was a slip of paper no larger than a calling card. On it, a single line. If I do not return by the 9th bell, protect the man who finds this. Holmes's expression turned unreadable. She anticipated interference, I said. More than that, Holmes replied, pocketing the slip. She anticipated betrayal. He turned to Penkett. Do you know who she feared? I have my suspicions, Penkett said darkly, but no proof. Only a name she whispered once, Finch. The father? No. The son. Holmes straightened. Then I must speak to Mr. Percival Finch again. A brewing confrontation. As we left the Langham, the gas lamps flickered to life along Portland Place, casting yellow halos in the damp. Holmes walked quickly now, his jaw set. Watson, he said, this mystery turns upon timing. The 9th bell, the secret note, the garden ledger, all coordinated, all intentional. Miss Calvel staged her disappearance to expose something, but she was counting on one of us to reach her first. And now I fear someone else may have. Percival Finch, barrister of the Inner Temple, and until recently the groom-to-be of a vanished bride, was not at his chambers when we arrived the next morning. A clerk with ink-stained cuffs informed us that Mr. Finch had taken indefinite leave following the personal calamity and had not returned since the wedding. Holmes gave a faint hum, neither surprised nor satisfied. "Did he leave a forwarding address?" he asked. The clerk shook his head, only said he'd be writing from his aunt's residence in Hampstead, but no precise direction. Though he added, lowering his voice, "There's been a flurry of correspondence, all from the same hand, delivered daily since Thursday. Do you have any of the envelopes?" The clerk hesitated, then opened a drawer and handed one to Holmes. The rest were taken by Mr. Finch himself, but this arrived yesterday, and no one came for it. Holmes examined the envelope, which bore no return address, only a crest stamped into the wax seal, a dove in flight over a laurel crown. "The same symbol as the faint mirror writing," he murmured. He turned it over and carefully slit it open. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, embossed at the header with St. Dovecourt School for Girls. The message was brief. "I was right not to trust them. Come alone, after dark. Bring nothing but the envelope. Do not answer questions." There was no signature. Holmes folded the note carefully. "Watson," he said, "fetch your coat. We're going to Hampstead." The house on Primrose Vale. After inquiries at the Hampstead post office and a brief word with a flower vendor who remembered a tall man with pale gloves asking for Finch, we found ourselves standing outside a stone townhouse on Primrose Vale near the edge of the heath. It was a quiet street where the lamplighters moved slowly and children's voices echoed distantly from a playing field. Holmes rapped twice on the door. After a long pause, a young maid answered. Her cheeks were red from scrubbing, and she looked immediately alarmed by our appearance. "Is Mr. Finch receiving visitors?" Holmes asked with a practised softness. "He's not as unwell, sir," she stammered. "Been poorly since the wedding. Keep studying. I don't eat much." "We won't keep him long," Holmes said, already stepping inside. The maid didn't dare protest. She led us to a narrow room with tall windows and heavy curtains drawn against the daylight. Inside, Percival Finch sat hunched in an armchair by the hearth, staring into the unlit grate. He looked like a man aged 10 years in 4 days, gaunt, sleepless, and badly shaven. When he saw us, he did not rise. "I suppose you've come to accuse me," he said quietly. "Everyone else has." "I've come to ask what you haven't told us," Holmes replied. Finch let out a long breath. "There's too much, and yet not enough to explain any of it. Then begin with what you do know. Did you receive notes from Miss Calvell before the wedding?" Finch looked up. "I did. Several, each more cryptic than the last. She was frightened, but not of me. She said she had stumbled upon something in her father's library, and that she feared eyes from above." "Eyes from above?" I echoed. She was speaking in symbols. That was her habit. I believe she meant someone in a high position, someone watching from within our circle. Holmes leaned forward. "Did she ever name anyone? Hint at the Penfold Club? The shipping consortium?" Finch hesitated. "She mentioned her father's ledgers, but she wouldn't speak further. Said it wasn't safe even in letters. I asked her what she meant to do, and she said she'd vanish." He swallowed hard, voice tightening. She said it with such calm as though it were a rehearsal. She wanted to disappear long enough to draw attention to the truth. But she insisted she would come back to me, that she'd explain everything once it was safe. Holmes studied him in silence for several seconds. "Then you didn't expect her to vanish at the altar?" "No," Finch said bitterly. "She promised she'd wait until after the ceremony, until we were alone. I didn't think she'd go through with it in public." He turned away. "But I also didn't expect my father's name to be in those ledgers. I didn't know about any of it." Holmes's voice was low. You recognize the name listed in the Calcutta transaction? I do now, Finch said. I confronted my father the night before the wedding. He refused to explain, only said, "Some things fund the future, others bury the past." And now he's in Brussels or Cairo or vanished himself. I haven't heard from him since. Holmes nodded slowly. Then, with a motion almost too quick to follow, he produced the unopened letter we had retrieved from the clerk and held it out. "Do you know this seal?" Finch paled. "Yes, it's the school her cousin Delia once attended. Honora mentioned it as a place she visited a year ago, looking into someone's history. She said the place taught women how to disappear." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Come again?" Finch waved vaguely. That was her phrase. "They teach you how to disappear politely." I thought she was joking. Holmes stood, his movements precise. She wasn't. "She left that envelope knowing someone might retrieve it. Perhaps not you. Perhaps anyone who knew how to read the signs." He paused at the threshold. "Mr. Finch, your fiancée has not been taken yet, at least. She's placed herself in the middle of a very dangerous game, and I fear the next move belongs to someone who does not intend for her to resurface." A message in the margins. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat with the envelope under a magnifying glass for over an hour. I watched from the settee, sipping a tepid cup of tea, unsure whether to speak or wait for him to announce a revelation. At last, he tapped the parchment with a fingernail. "Watson," he said, "look here." Beneath the inner flap of the envelope, faintly embossed in the margin, were the words, "Oak Chamber, 3rd floor. Ask for Miss Greaves. Knock 4 times. "Miss Greaves," I said, "a pseudonym, no doubt, but a useful one. We now have an address in spirit, if not yet in stone." He stood suddenly. "We must find St. Dovecourt. There, I believe, the veil will begin to lift." And with that the chase resumed, not just for a missing bride, but for the secret world she had willingly stepped into. The following morning broke cold and bright, with a brittle sort of light that felt more surgical than cheerful. A frost had silvered the edges of the window panes at 221B Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson brought in our breakfast with a note of concern about Holmes's untouched tea from the previous night. He had remained at his desk until dawn, cross-referencing school registries, obscure building permits, and parish records. "Dovecourt," he muttered, poring over the final page of an 1879 directory, was not always a school. It was once a boarding house for women of distinction in distress, rebranded after a scandal involving a vanished heiress and a falsified marriage certificate. He jabbed a finger at the page. "Here. The building is located on the northern fringe of Chelsea, tucked behind St. Simon's Church. It was rechartered in 1888 as St. Dovecourt School for Select Young Ladies, but its facade still bears the original ironwork initials, DH, for Dovecourt House." He stood abruptly, snapping the book shut. "Come, Watson, if we knock 4 times at the 3rd floor oak chamber and ask for Miss Greaves, we may yet find our vanished bride, or what remains of her shadow." The Dovecourt facade. The cab ride to Chelsea was uneventful, but I couldn't shake a peculiar tightness in my chest, the feeling of stepping into territory not meant for men, or detectives, or anyone who wasn't bound by secrecy. The building itself sat behind a high brick wall topped with spirals of wrought iron. A brass plate at the gate bore the words, "St. Dovecourt Private School for the Advancement of Young Women." It might have been mistaken for any genteel finishing school, but for the odd silence that hung in the air, no chatter of students, no clatter of dishes or piano practice, only the slow creak of wind moving through old hedges. Holmes rapped the iron gate 4 times. A small side panel opened. A woman's eyes appeared sharp, brown, assessing. "Yes?" she asked. "We're expected," Holmes said smoothly. "Oak chamber, 3rd floor, Miss Greaves." A pause, then a nod. The door clicked open. We were led by a silent, uniformed maid through a dim entry hall lined with gas sconces and ancestral portraits none labelled. The air was thick with lavender polish and the faintest trace of old smoke. The staircase curved upward like a question mark, each tread more polished than the last. At the third floor, the maid knocked 4 times on a heavy oak door, with a copper plaque that bore no name. A voice from within answered crisply, "Enter." The room beyond was warm, tidy, and sparsely furnished. Books lined the far wall, a globe stood in the corner, and beside it a writing desk with inkwells arranged in perfect symmetry. A woman sat behind it, her silver-streaked hair pulled tightly back, her grey dress immaculate. She could have been 50 or 70. Her face gave nothing away. "You are not former students," she said. "No," Holmes replied. "We're seeking one who may have passed through here under instruction or protection." She gave him a long look. "You know the code?" "Yes." "Then you know what discretion means." Holmes stepped forward. "I know what silence can cost. A young woman vanished on the morning of her wedding. She left clues that led here. Her name is Honora Calvel." The woman's fingers rested atop a ledger. "We have no such pupil registered. She would not have used her own name." "Then how do you propose I assist?" Holmes withdrew the slip of paper from the envelope and laid it on the desk. "She left this message. Ask for Miss Greaves. That is you." The woman stared at the card. Her face did not change, but something in her shoulders eased. "She said someone would come," she said quietly. "I hoped it would be him. I see now it was never meant to be." A hidden curriculum. She motioned for us to sit. "This institution was never a school in the traditional sense," she began. "It is a sanctuary for women seeking reinvention, escape, or erasure. We teach more than deportment. We teach how to vanish without noise, without fear, and with purpose." Holmes leaned forward. "And Miss Calvel? She came to us 6 months ago under the name Miss Farrow. She was bright, cautious, and very determined. She asked to be trained in calculated absence. I asked no questions. We never do. But I did ask her once why she wanted to disappear." Miss Greaves paused. She said, "Because they only listen when you're not in the room." "She was planning the spectacle even then," Holmes murmured. "She requested the tools to fabricate a credible fainting fit, hide within architectural recesses, signal an ally at a given hour, and vanish cleanly without being pursued." "And you granted this?" I asked, incredulous. Miss Greaves's eyes were cold. "You men often misinterpret safety as control. We offer escape." She paid in full with a small inheritance and a sapphire ring. "Did she say what threat she feared?" Holmes pressed. Greaves hesitated, only once. She said, "If I expose the rot in my father's books, I will wake ghosts far worse than debt." She spoke of a ledger, a list of names, payments, and ship manifests. She feared it had links beyond her father. Holmes's expression darkened. She was right. Greaves nodded solemnly. She returned to us 3 days before her wedding, left a packet with instructions. If she did not reappear within 3 days of the ceremony, it was to be delivered to one name only. "Whose?" Greaves opened a drawer and handed Holmes a sealed envelope. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 291B Baker Street." Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet written in Honora's meticulous hand. "Mr. Holmes, if this finds you, then I failed to outpace them. I left a trail I hoped you alone would follow. The man who stood beside me at the altar is not my enemy, but someone behind him is. Trust no one wearing the dove seal. They know I found the missing ledger page, the one torn from 1884. It proves someone funded a false manifest tied to the Harrow Street fire. A woman died that night. She had a child. That child may still live. It was never about me. It was about who I found. Find her before they do. Holmes's face turned grim. The Harrow Street fire, he whispered. Watson, that was the warehouse blaze the press dismissed as a gas leak. But the coroner found human remains and signs of restraint. I felt a chill move through me. You think Honora uncovered something far more sinister? I think, Holmes said slowly, that she found a witness hidden in the ashes of a cover-up. And now she's disappeared not to save herself but to protect someone else. He turned to Miss Greaves. Do you know where she is now? Greaves shook her head. She was to signal me with a letter left at the chapel steps. It never came. Holmes rose. Then it's already begun. Someone intercepted her, or followed her trail faster than we did. His voice sharpened. Watson, we must return to Finch. He may hold the final thread, or worse, he may be the next to vanish. The chill of Chelsea clung to us as we rode north toward Hampstead, Holmes silent for most of the journey, his fingers pressed steeple-like beneath his chin. I had come to recognize this posture as his most dangerous state. Not rest, but preparations, coiled calculation, awaiting the precise moment to strike. He may already be gone, Holmes said at last. You mean Finch? I asked. I mean anyone who knew where Honora might go next. The message in her letter was not vague by accident. It was encoded, but only barely. The Harrow Street fire was no local blaze, Watson. It was a torch set to a specific ledger. She believes the child of that unknown victim survived, and that someone with power is determined to erase the final witness. I frowned. But how does Finch factor into that? Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the blurred city beyond the window. He's the loose end. Honora trusted him, perhaps foolishly, but she also knew he was being watched. If our faceless adversary believes Finch holds more than he's let on, he becomes either a liability or a target. The cab jolted to a halt outside the quiet house on Primrose Vale. Fog lay low along the cobbled path, curling over the garden wall like breath on a winter's morning. At first glance, all appeared as we had left it, but as we approached the front steps, Holmes stopped abruptly. "Watson," he murmured, "do you smell that?" I sniffed. "Smoke? Not wood," he replied grimly. "Cordite." He drew his revolver from his coat, and I followed suit instinctively. With a swift kick, he flung open the front door. It creaked inward, not locked, not even latched. The hall was silent, too silent. The room with no answer. We moved carefully through the ground floor parlor, dining room, and study, all empty. No sign of struggle, but a teacup sat on the table, still faintly steaming, untouched. A newspaper lay folded to the society column, a crimson circle drawn around Honora's name. Holmes motioned toward the stairs. We climbed quietly, pausing at the landing. Finch's bedroom door was ajar. Holmes pushed it open with the muzzle of his pistol. The room was in disarray, the bed half made, papers strewn across the desk, and an overturned chair by the fireplace. A wardrobe door hung open, its interior bare save a forgotten necktie and an empty valise. And on the hearthrug, pinned, beneath the heavy brass poker, was a silver cigarette case, the same one Penkett had shown us days earlier. Holmes knelt beside it. The case had been crushed, the velvet lining torn open. But something else had been tucked behind the lining, a torn photograph. Holmes extracted it carefully. It showed a young woman in nurse's attire, standing beside a railway platform marked Dover, 1885. Her face was familiar. "Honora's mother?" I asked. Holmes shook his head slowly. "Look closer. The eyes are the same as Honora's, but the chin, the posture, no. This woman is not her mother. She is too young, too recent." He turned it over. On the back was a faded pencil note. "L. Marchant, St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, Chiswick." Delia Marchant. Holmes breathed. The cousin? I asked, startled. But she's no orphan. Holmes rose. No, Watson, she's the child Honora found, the one who wasn't supposed to exist. And she was planted close, perhaps by chance, perhaps not. But it explains why Honora was so intent on disappearing without alerting anyone. She wasn't fleeing, she was buying time to protect someone. He paced to the window, then stopped short. A black motor car stood idling across the street. Two figures sat inside, one at the wheel, the other watching the house with the stillness of a hunter. They've already come for him, Holmes said flatly. Finch is gone, taken or driven underground. I gripped the back of a chair. So what do we do? We followed the photograph, Holmes replied. We found the asylum. And we find Delia Marchant before they realize who she truly is. The asylum record, St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, stood in Chiswick, its grey stone facade just visible through a tangle of bare-branched trees. The matron, a thin woman with wire spectacles and a voice like slate, scraping on slate, allowed us access to the old records on the condition that we didn't disrupt the girls. Holmes flipped quickly through the thick ledgers, stopping on an entry from the winter of 1885. Marchant, Lillian Foundling, female, age 3. Deposited anonymously at the gate, accompanied by scrap of paper reading, "Forgive me, protect her, no other identifiers." Holmes tapped the page. She was placed here 3 months after the Harrow Street fire, he said. And note the name given Marchant, likely assigned by the nuns, but no connection to the Calvel family on record. I frowned. And yet she ends up a cousin, or presented as one, Holmes said. Calvel was powerful. If someone wanted to erase a child's history and rewrite it, he had the means. He turned sharply. Watson, we need to find Delia, not speak to her. Find her quietly, because if we've drawn this line from fire to family, someone else may already be tracing it too. A warning in the fog. We returned to Baker Street well past sundown. A letter awaited us, hand-delivered, unmarked, sealed in black wax. Holmes opened it without a word. You have tread too far. Turn back. The bride is lost. Let the ashes lie where they fell. No signature, no crest. Only a smear of soot at the bottom corner. I looked at Holmes. A warning? He nodded, but his mouth tightened, or a confession. He crossed to the fireplace and tossed the letter into the flames. Watson, he said, we are no longer chasing a vanished bride. We are unraveling the aftermath of a murder buried in bureaucracy, sealed in false identities and dressed in silks. He turned slowly, eyes catching the firelight. And somewhere out there, Delia Marchant, the orphan who was never meant to survive, may be the last thread left holding this secret together. The morning that followed the anonymous warning arrived not with light, but with mist, thick, yellow, and clinging to the cobbled streets like a second skin. It coiled through the alleys of Baker Street and muffled the clip of hooves, turning London into a city half forgotten by its own sunlight. Holmes, however, was unshaken by threats. He stood at the mantelpiece, unmoving, eyes fixed not on the flames, but on a small map he had pinned above the hearth. A single dot marked the asylum in Chiswick. Another, further east, marked St. Hilda's. And now he added a third Bloomsbury Square. Delia Marchant is no longer at the Calvel estate, he said. She left late last night, according to a footman I spoke to before dawn. Told them she was going to visit her aunt in Ealing. But no such aunt exists. And you traced her instead to Bloomsbury? I asked, rubbing warmth into my fingers. Holmes nodded, an address found in a boarding ledger at St. Dovecourt. She used it once, briefly, when she first arrived in London. A woman named Mrs. Broggins runs the house and rents rooms to women under assumed names. It is the sort of place people go when they want to be anyone else, and you think Delia's returned there? I think someone wants her to, and that means she's in danger. The door on Doddington Street. By mid-morning, we stood before number 14 Doddington Street, an unimpressive brownstone with fading shutters and an iron gate that squealed when Holmes opened it. The stoop was damp with condensation, and a pair of scuffed galoshes sat just inside the entryway. Mrs. Broggins herself answered. She was large, pale, and wore a stained apron. She smelled faintly of tobacco and starch. "No rooms," she said instantly. "We're not here for lodgings," Holmes replied. "We're looking for a woman, Delia Marchant. She may be using the name Miss Lillian or Miss Merton." Mrs. Broggins frowned. "You police?" "No," Holmes said, "but she's in danger, and she doesn't know it." That gave the woman pause. "Miss Lillian," she murmured. "Took room 4 on the top floor just last night. Said she'd be staying no more than 2 days. Quiet girl, kept her hat indoors." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "Is she in now?" I asked. "She hasn't come down since breakfast. You can go up. But don't frighten her. She's already got nerves like a kitten." We ascended the narrow stairs quietly. Room 4's door was closed, its key still in the lock. Holmes knocked softly. No reply. He knocked again 4 short taps. This time we heard movement, a latch drawn. The door opened a crack. Behind it stood Delia Marchant, her eyes wide, face pale, hair tucked beneath a scarf. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "Yes, may we come in?" She hesitated, then opened the door fully and stepped back. The room was small but neat, a single bed, a trunk, a writing desk, and a kettle warming on a coal stove. Curtains were drawn tight. On the desk sat a leather folder tied with ribbon. "I knew she'd send someone," Delia said softly. "I didn't think it would be you." "You spoke to Honora before she vanished?" Holmes asked. Delia nodded. "She came to me in the early morning on the day of the wedding. Said it was all happening faster than she expected, that someone had intercepted her letter to Colonel Penkett. She told me to run if anything happened to her." "And yet you stayed." Delia looked away. "I thought she might be overreacting. We've always shared stories, grown up as cousins, even if that wasn't truly the case. She never told me everything. Only that my mother had died in a fire, that I was raised by arrangement. And then 3 weeks ago she showed me the torn page from her father's ledger." "The one linking the Calvel Consortium to the Harrow Street warehouse?" Holmes asked. "Yes." She said someone had falsified the manifest of goods. That the fire wasn't an accident, it was arson meant to erase a witness, and that my mother had been that witness. She trembled now, and I stepped forward to steady her. "I thought my mother was just poor," Delia said. "But Honora said she might have worked for the consortium as a ledger clerk or translator. She suspected she uncovered something she wasn't meant to." Holmes opened the leather folder on the desk. Inside were copies of documents, some dated, some half-burned. One in particular bore a red wax seal. "Watson," he said, handing me the page, "look at the signature." I read it aloud. "Harriet L. Finch." My breath caught. "Finch?" I said. "As in Percival's mother?" Delia nodded. "Honora believed our mothers knew each other, that they both worked on the same project, the India shipments, but only one survived." Holmes stared at the page in silence. She feared that someone in the Finch family, not Percival, but perhaps his father, orchestrated the fire, and that Robert Calvel helped cover it up to preserve his shipping interests. Delia clutched her scarf. She never meant to leave him at the altar. She wanted to confront her father after the ceremony with evidence and with witnesses. But when she realized someone had accessed her dressing room the night before, she changed her plan. She said she couldn't risk someone silencing me before the truth came out. Holmes's jaw tightened. And yet she vanished all the same. Delia stepped closer. She left one final note for you, Mr. Holmes. Told me to give it only if I believed you hadn't betrayed her. She pulled a folded page from her coat and handed it to him. It was written in Honora's familiar hand. If this reaches you, then I have not been silenced. But someone will try. The dove is not a symbol of peace. It is a cage. The girl is the key. Protect her, and trust no man who uses ink without asking whose blood it was mixed with. Holmes read it twice, then tucked it into his coat. We must move you, he said to Delia. You are no longer safe here, and neither is anyone who harboured you. I know, she whispered. I've known since the moment I saw a man with silver cufflinks waiting outside the asylum. My eyes widened. He followed you? Delia nodded. I thought I lost him in the fog, but I wasn't sure. Not until this morning when I found this under my door. She handed us a card blank except for a smear of soot and the words, You are a page that was meant to burn. Holmes folded the card, face grim. Watson, we leave immediately. Bring your revolver. We'll shelter Miss Marchant at Penkett's private lodge on the Thames. It's isolated, and Colonel Penkett owes us cooperation. And then, I asked, then we draw out the man with the cufflinks because he knows Honora isn't gone for good. The Thames lay quiet under a violet dusk as our hired boat drew close to the shore near Old Shepperton, where the private lodge belonging to Colonel Penkett stood like a stoic guardian among the trees. It was a modest affair, timber-framed with shuttered windows and ivy creeping up its walls. Smoke curled lazily from its single chimney. The path from the small jetty to the lodge was overgrown and silent, disturbed only by our footfalls and the occasional flutter of waterfowl retreating into the reeds. Delia Marchant sat between Holmes and me, swaddled in a wool shawl, her eyes darting to every rustle in the thickets. "Are you sure no one followed us?" she asked, for the third time. Holmes, ever patient in moments of peril, gave her a calm nod. We took 3 turns by cab, boarded a mail cart, changed drivers at Richmond, and approached by water. If anyone followed us, they deserve an ovation. Colonel Penkett himself met us at the threshold. Dressed in his shirt-sleeves, he looked both surprised and grim when he saw Delia. "She looks just like her mother," he said softly. "You found her." "No," Holmes corrected. "She found herself. We merely followed the trail she was forced to leave." The colonel stepped aside and let us in. The main room of the lodge was warm and sparsely furnished with an open hearth, a few chairs, a sideboard stocked with brandy and bread. Holmes instructed Penkett to prepare the upper bedroom for Delia and post one of his men at the only road entrance leading to the lodge. "We'll stay the night," he said, "but be wary. We are not alone in knowing this address, a house with secrets." That evening, as frost laced the windows and the fire crackled low, Holmes sat at the wooden writing desk near the hearth, reading again the letter Honora had penned, the one passed to us by Delia in the boarding-house. He spoke without looking up. "She knew everything, Watson, or nearly everything. She traced the fire at Harrow Street not just to the shipping ledgers, but to a specific name, Finch, not the son, the father, Percival Finch Sr. He was the legal architect who devised a false import shell company to funnel stolen assets out of India. Honora's mother, by all evidence, had uncovered the laundering process and was preparing to expose it. I paced slowly behind him, arms crossed. And Robert Calvell funded the scheme, or, more likely, profited from it unknowingly at first. When the fire erased Harriet Finch and the original ledgers, Calvell used his influence to smooth it over, and he adopted the child left behind Delia not out of kindness, but guilt. I turned toward the stairs, listening for any sound above. "And you believe Honora discovered this only recently?" Holmes set the letter down. She found the remaining ledger pages buried beneath the floorboards of the conservatory. She recognized Delia's name in the orphanage records and realized the girl she called cousin was in fact the daughter of a murdered woman. He rose and walked to the window. But she also knew that the people behind it, those still profiting from the erased past, would silence anyone who tried to revive it. He drew back the curtain an inch and peered outside. The question is, he added, did she disappear to protect Delia or to draw the guilty into the open? A visitor in the fog. It was close to midnight when the sound came of the faint crunch of boots on frost-bitten gravel, barely audible beneath the wind. Holmes was up instantly, motioning for me to douse the lanterns. Penkett, already awake, had a revolver in hand and took position near the back window. I stood by the hearth, pistol drawn. The knock at the door was soft. 4 taps. Delia, who had descended in slippers and shawl, froze in the corner. "That's the signal Honora gave me," she whispered. 4 taps. "That's how she told me to knock at Dovecourt. It's her." Holmes held up a hand for silence. Then, with swift, soundless steps, he crossed to the door and opened it. A woman stood there, soaked with rain, her veil clinging to her cheeks. Beneath the dripping hat, her eyes met Holmes's. "Mr. Holmes," she said breathlessly, "you found her?" Delia let out a small gasp. "Honora!" The cousins rushed to one another, embracing tightly. But Holmes, ever alert, studied the woman's posture, her boots, and the state of her hands. "You came on foot?" he asked. "Yes," Honora replied, "from a cottage near Brentford. I've been hiding for 4 days, waiting to confirm I wasn't followed. Yet you knew we'd be here." She nodded. I saw the man with the silver cufflinks watching Penkett's flat. When he left, I slipped back and found his matchbook. It bore the name of this lodge. I knew you'd brought Delia somewhere safe, and I prayed you'd come here. Holmes led her inside, eyes never leaving the dark beyond the path. "I fear you weren't alone for long," he said quietly. "This visit may have tipped our hand." Honora turned to him, eyes sharp now. "Then it's time we finish what we started. I still have the torn page, the one with Finch Senior's seal. If we publish it, if we deliver it to the right magistrate, they'll bury it." Holmes interrupted. "Or bury you?" She stared at him. "Then what?" Holmes turned to Penkett. "We make them come to us. We release word discreetly that Honora will deliver her testimony at the Admiralty office, in full view of legal counsel and press. No secrecy, no private settlements." "And the guilty?" I asked. "Will try to stop us before we get there," Holmes replied. "And when they do, we shall be ready." He looked back at Honora. "The dove may be a cage, but tonight, Miss Calvell, we shall make it sing." The next morning dawned brittle and pale, with the Thames veiled in a fog so thick it swallowed the trees and blurred the river's edge into oblivion. Within the lodge, the tension was tangible, a quiet hum in the floorboards, in the breath between sentences, in the glances exchanged across the breakfast table. Holmes had risen before the sun and already wired 2 messages, one to Lestrade at Scotland Yard and the other to a discreet contact at the Morning Chronicle. "Today," he said, folding the last of the telegram slips into his coat pocket, "we give our adversaries something they cannot abide by daylight." Delia Marchant stood beside the hearth, pale but composed, dressed in a navy cloak that had once belonged to her late mother. Honora, wearing a borrowed coat of Penkett's, sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her fingers trembling faintly but her eyes clear. "Will it work?" she asked Holmes. "It will force their hand," he replied. "That is the only certainty I require." The decoy and the trap Holmes had devised the plan during the night, scrawling it across a half-dozen pages of Penkett's stationery, revising it twice before dawn. At precisely 11 o'clock, word would be delivered to 3 points of influence. the Inner Temple, the Penfold Club, and the central office of the Calvel Consortium. The message was simple: Honora Calvel to deliver testimony and documents pertaining to Harrow Street Fire Admiralty Office, noon today. Press invited, counsel present. Holmes turned to Penkett. "You'll take the decoy?" The colonel, still in his regimental coat and with a pistol holstered under his overcoat, nodded. "One of your agents, I presume?" "Inspector Lestrade has sent a woman from the force in plain clothes, similar build to Miss Calvel. She'll travel by carriage under guard, escorted to the Admiralty building. The real Honora and Delia will remain here under Watson's protection." "And you?" I asked. Holmes gave a tight smile. "I shall go fishing." "What bait?" I said. He lifted the leather folder, the original ledger pages recovered from the conservatory floor. "This," he said, "contains the only copy of the missing manifest, and if the right eyes see me carrying it, they will follow." The man with the silver cufflinks. Holmes departed alone by boat, his coat collar turned high, the folder tucked beneath his arm. He disembarked at a pier near Westminster and made a deliberate show of passing beneath gas lamps and through open market, slow enough to be followed, but swift enough to tempt rash pursuit. And as he'd predicted, the man appeared near Charing Cross, tall, grey-cloaked, silver cufflinks glinting with every step. He followed Holmes down the Strand, past Somerset House, then turned, as Holmes ducked into a side alley. But Holmes did not emerge. Instead, two constables and Lestrade himself stepped out from behind a cart, revolvers raised. "Jeremy Halverston," Lestrade said with grim satisfaction, "former solicitor for the Finch estate. Now implicated in 2 disappearances, 1 warehouse fire, and a falsified ledger trail. You've been a busy man." Halverston's smile barely twitched. "I don't know what you mean." "Then perhaps the documents you followed Mr. Holmes to intercept might refresh your memory," Lestrade replied. "You were rather eager to ensure they didn't reach the Admiralty." Holmes reappeared at the alley's end, dusting soot from his gloves. "I told you," he said to Lestrade, "he'd take the bait, the confrontation. Back at the lodge I had taken every precaution, bolts drawn, a revolver within reach, and Penkett's man stationed outside on a rotating watch. Yet when the knock came too short, too long, my heart dropped. It was the signal we'd not prepared for. Delia froze mid-step. Honora stepped back from the window. Then the voice. "I came with news," Holmes called. "Let me in, Watson, quickly." I unlatched the door. He swept inside, mud on his boots, breath visible in the cold. His eyes burned with urgency. "He confessed," Holmes said. "Not everything, but enough." We gathered in the sitting room. He tossed the man's card onto the table. Jeremy Halverston, the legal mind behind the shell company used to obscure the shipping thefts. More importantly, the one who orchestrated the Harrow Street arson and covered up the death of Harriet Finch. Delia's face was unreadable. "He knew the child had survived?" she asked. Holmes shook his head. He suspected. "But he did not know it was you." That connection remained buried until Honora found the orphan records. Once she began asking questions, the Penfold Club sent Halverston to ensure silence. "And Finch's father?" I asked. "Dead. 2 years ago, but his legacy remained. A fortune protected by legal tricks and veiled threats. Halverston was the last custodian of that secret, until now." The final page. Holmes turned to Honora. "You did well. You vanished without losing yourself. You risked exposure to protect her, and in doing so, brought the past to justice." Honora exhaled, trembling. "I thought I'd have to carry it alone." "You didn't," Holmes said simply. The following day, the Morning Chronicle printed the entire story ledger excerpts, Harrow Street records, and witness testimony. No names were given where safety required silence. But the truth had emerged, smoky and scarred, into the light. Delia Marchant would not return to the Calvel estate. Instead, she accepted a modest trust arranged quietly by Penkett and left London for the south coast to begin studies in legal advocacy, a fitting pursuit for a girl raised in the shadows of false papers. Honora, for her part, never resumed the title of bride. She told me once, in a letter months later, that she preferred being the woman who vanished at the aisle because that was the moment she chose to walk toward truth, not tradition. And Holmes? Holmes said nothing at all. But as we stood on the terrace of the lodge that final morning, watching the river carry the fog away, I noticed he had kept the final ledger page in his coat pocket, not out of necessity but memory. By the time spring broke across London with the scent of lilac and coal smoke mingling on the breeze, the matter of the vanished bride had all but passed into public legend. The Morning Chronicle had, true to its editorial leanings, painted the mystery as a tale of noble sacrifice and conspiratorial aristocracy. No names were named, but the innuendo alone had sent ripples through the shipping world and shuttered at least 2 legal firms with long-standing connections to overseas trade. Holmes read the coverage once, then never mentioned it again. It was on such a mild, grey and dusted morning that I found Holmes once more at the window of our Baker Street sitting room, his silhouette cut in familiar profile against the overcast sky. He was holding the final page of the Calvel ledger between 2 fingers, reading its contents for what must have been the 100th time. "Still at it?" I asked, setting down the tea tray. He nodded absently. The ink used in this ledger was cheap, iron gall, common. But here look at the smudge on the lower margin, a correction made after the fact. The figure was altered from 220 to 120. Curious. He passed me the page, though we both knew every word of it by now. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "That someone not only profited from the fire, but invested in its memory," Holmes replied. "They inflated the damage to collect insurance. What was lost in the warehouse was never meant to arrive. It was imaginary stock." He turned from the window. The fire wasn't to destroy evidence. It was the evidence. I stared at him. Then the woman who died, Harriet Finch, was collateral damage. Holmes's expression darkened, and the girl who loved Delia was the uncalculated remainder, a variable someone forgot to erase. The last interview week later, we received an unexpected invitation. Miss Honora Calvel requested our presence at a small flat in Kensington, newly acquired under her own name. No longer living at the Calvel estate, she had assumed an independent life funded by a modest inheritance left untouched during her father's reign. The family fortune, it turned out, was now the subject of a long and quiet audit. When we arrived, she greeted us with warm hands and a calm expression. Not a bride betrayed, nor a fugitive in hiding, but a woman who had outlived her scandal and emerged stronger for it. "There is one last thing I must give you," she said, handing Holmes a small box of silver birch. Inside was a pair of lace gloves slightly scorched at the edges and a crumpled letter, half-burned but legible. It was addressed to H.L. Finch and dated 2 days before the Harrow Street fire. "Harriet, if you're reading this, then I've lost my nerve. But you must leave. They suspect too much. Burn what you have. Take the child and vanish. Do not trust the solicitor. He is no friend to us." R.C. Holmes read it in silence. "R.C.," he said. "Robert Calvel. The one act of decency too late." Honora nodded. My father knew. He tried to undo it, but it was already too far gone. And when he found Delia had survived, he placed her in our household under a false name and tried to love her the way he couldn't love the truth. She looked out the window. He never forgave himself, but he never confessed either. Holmes closed the box gently and returned it to her. "And what will you do now?" Honora smiled faintly. "Live, perhaps help others do the same. I've been accepted as a clerk at a small legal aid office in Greenwich. I imagine it will be full of tedious filings and unremarkable cases. But it will be honest." She looked between us. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a bride who ran." Holmes inclined his head. "You didn't run, you orchestrated. The world may never know the full tale, but it will benefit from its outcome. A reflection in gaslight." Back at Baker Street that evening, I found Holmes unusually contemplative. He had lit his pipe and was standing at the window again, the fog turning the gaslights outside into small yellow planets. He spoke after a long silence. "You know, Watson, the curious thing about truth is how little it changes outcomes. The guilty retreat, the innocent survive, but the machinery rolls on." I raised my eyebrows. "You sound almost disappointed." "Not disappointed," he said, merely observant. The dove, as she wrote, was never a symbol of peace, only a shield, a mask. He tapped the ledger page one last time before slipping it into the fire. It flared and curled and was gone. "What happened to Halverston?" I asked. "Released on bail. Disbarred, but free. No witnesses willing to testify in court. And Finch Jr. has vanished again, some say to South Africa. Others say he never left London. And the Penfold Club? Still hosting dinners, still drinking port." "The world turns slowly, Watson, but it does turn." He exhaled and turned to me. "I believe we have earned a case of simplicity next. Perhaps a missing cat, or a contested will." I smiled. "I wouldn't count on it." "No," Holmes admitted, "nor would I." He returned to the armchair, lifted his violin from the side table, and drew the bow across the strings with a sigh that was almost musical. And outside, London continued to breathe, its secrets shelved, its ghosts unburied, and the river moving ever onward, indifferent to the truths whispered along its banks.